Have you ever walked through Times Square and thought to yourself, hey, how the did this even happen? Well, I did, so I decided to make a video answering that exact question. Why is America's busiest intersection covered in advertisements? The answer might seem straightforward. It's full of pedestrians, so companies are willing to pay a premium to shove their product or service in front of as many eyes as possible. Like Super Bowl commercials, except on the street. But there's actually a lot more to the story. What if I told you that there was a time when Times Square had exactly 0 advertisements? What if I told you that there was a time when Times Square wasn't even called Times Square at all? And what if I told you that Times Square isn't even a square? You might already know that last bit, but what you probably don't know is that Times Square isn't just a single intersection. It's an hourglass-shaped confluence, a collection of intersections, centered around where 7th Avenue meets Broadway meets 42nd Street. You could say that Times Square is the cultural and geographical heart of Manhattan, but back in the 19th century, this was farmland, way north of what the Dutch, English, and early Americans had already developed. Times Square's urban design was born when Broadway expanded to the north and clashed with the construction of the street grid established by the Commissioner's Plan of 1811. Once it was created, Times Square was initially referred to as Longacre Square, drawing inspiration from London, England's famous carriage-building street, Longacre. That's because New York's Longacre Square became known for the exact same thing, serving as the bustling epicenter of the city's horse, stable, cart, and carriage industries through the late 1800s. The square nomenclature refers to its function as a public square, not exactly the same shape of the city's other public squares, Washington Square, Madison Square, but a public gathering place nonetheless. This square's unique urban layout consisted of long, triangular traffic islands that offered deep, unobstructed sightlines looking north and south through the cityscape. Early on, advertisers realized that images placed on the apex of these triangles could be seen for several blocks down the wide avenues. There was already plenty of foot traffic in the area thanks to the carriage industry, and as the late 1890s and early 1900s saw the proliferation of the theater industry along Broadway, pedestrian activity exploded here, both day and night. It wasn't long before billboards made of wood and canvas advertising cigar companies, amusement parks, tonics, and talcum powders began colonizing the low-rise rooftops and early theater houses cropping up around Longacre Square. However, commercial advertising really only took off here after the 1894 announcement of the New York City subway system, then known as Interborough Rapid Transit. Some of the system's first lines were to be built converging right beneath the road within Longacre Square, specifically right under 7th Avenue and 42nd Street. And that's exactly what happened, and it's still the case today. Times Square 42nd Street Station is the busiest subway station in New York City. The 1894 announcement sparked a huge wave of real estate speculation here, with developers, advertisers, and entrepreneurs correctly predicting the subway would bring in even more foot traffic to the already bustling public square. One of those entrepreneurs was the owner of the New York Times, Adolph S. Ochs. He purchased a highly visible, flat-iron-shaped plot of land at the southern end of Longacre Square and constructed a brand new headquarters building for the newspaper company. That building is still around today, sort of. The one Times Square building has been torn apart, remodeled, and covered in digital screens enough times to where its structure is completely unrecognizable today, even if some of the bones still remain intact. As the subway tunnels were being excavated below Longacre Square in 1904, the owner of the New York Times successfully lobbied the City Board of Aldermen to rename the square after his newspaper, and thus, Times Square was officially born. But the turn of the century didn't just usher in underground rapid transit and electric streetcars throughout Times Square. It also coincided with the widespread use of incandescent light bulbs. The revolutionary new technology replaced gas lamps inside theaters and street lamps. But soon enough, the light bulb found itself being used to brighten up marquees and liven up billboards themselves. On the topic of billboards specifically, there was one man, Oscar J. Good, who practically invented the modern billboard design. Good recognized that while the human eye mostly ignores static text, it can't help but fixate on motion, especially when it's paired with light. The advertiser coined the term spectaculars to describe the oversized style of billboard he pioneered, which used automated electrical flashers to simulate motion in visual advertisement. The designers at the O.J. Good Company were masters of their craft, creating Times Square's very first electric billboards in 1904. It started with a flashing promotion for the Trimble Whiskey Company, a first-of-its-kind electric advertisement fronting the Studebaker Building at 47th Street. That billboard was followed by other ads for Budweiser, Studebaker themselves, and most famously Wrigley's Chewing Gum in 1917, which was installed atop the Putnam Building between 43rd and 44th Streets. This was the world's largest sign at the time. By the 1920s, these spectaculars were the talk of the town, massive blinking signs that defied everything seen in standard billboard design. By the 1930s, advertisers were essentially weaponizing their intricate billboard technology against each other. Advertisements got bigger, brighter, bolder, and eventually covered the entire facades of some of Times Square's most beautiful buildings. The sightlines of Times Square that were once dominated by transportation, history, culture, and locality were now dominated by corporatism and hyper-capitalism. Instead of focusing on buildings and faces and people and traffic, these massive, bright advertisements forced your eye to focus on Coca-Cola, Chevrolet. In very rare cases, billboards took a more utilitarian form, like the zipper bulletin that debuted on the facade of the One Times Square building in 1928. In an age before the 24-hour news cycle, internet, and social media, this exact spot in Times Square was typically the fastest to break important news during major flashpoints in American history. The Japanese surrender that effectively ended World War II, the JFK assassination, the Apollo 11 moon landing. Not even the economic downturn of the Great Depression or the strict resource rationing of World War II could stop the advertising momentum of Times Square. When the wartime dim-outs of 1942 arrived, and the city was ordered to go dark during certain hours of the night, billboard advertisers pivoted towards mechanical 4D special effects. The most famous example from this era arrived in December 1941, when advertiser Douglas Lay unveiled the iconic Camel cigarette spectacular at 44th Street. This gargantuan display featured a soldier connected to a steam injection system that smoothly exhaled real steam into the Manhattan air every 4 seconds. Following World War II, the socio-economic landscape of New York City shifted drastically. Suburbanization, a decline in mass transit ridership, and the erosion of the city's manufacturing base pushed Times Square into a prolonged period of urban decay. By the 1960s and 70s, the historic theaters along Broadway and 42nd Street had largely been converted into grindhouse theaters, peep shows, and adult entertainment venues. It was a dark era for American cities, and even Times Square, the so-called center of the world, couldn't escape it. High vacancy rates meant that office rents could no longer cover the cost of heating, elevator maintenance, and building code compliance. Landlords figured that if the inside of the building couldn't make money, they had to maximize ad space on the outside to recoup their losses. During this era, Times Square's architecture largely became a metal frame, a hollow structural scaffold designed solely to hold up billboards. By the early 1980s, New York City knew that they had to do something to try and clean up the crime and squalor in Times Square. So in 1984, developers presented this multi-billion-dollar plan to completely reshape the neighborhood. They brought in architects like Philip Johnson and John Burgee to design a massive corporate office park, a collection of 4 identical granite towers that would have completely encased the neighborhood in 1980s corporate urban renewal. And to do that, they planned to strip away almost every single billboard advertisement in sight. However, a coalition of preservationists, lighting designers, and architects opposed the plan, arguing that Times Square's history and identity itself lay precisely within the brightly lit billboards. Ultimately, the advocates won out, successfully convincing city planners of exactly that whether they liked it or not, Times Square's billboards were the architecture to protect. Instead of erasing the billboards to save the neighborhood and rebuild anew, the Department of City Planning ultimately decided to legally protect them. This was accomplished with the 1987 Special Midtown District zoning regulations. It was a risky decision for the city to make. Other cities across the US were doing exactly the opposite. In the 1990s, Mayor Giuliani swept out the adult entertainment venues, clearing the stage for family-friendly tourism. Historic buildings were restored when possible, and when that wasn't possible, new office towers were built, with new LED digital billboards that were now legally required. Sort of the worst of both worlds. The Condé Nast building, the Morgan Stanley building, all of these new structures really benefited one group, and one group only: corporations. And those corporations had a huge incentive to turn Times Square's atmosphere into a selling point itself. The one thing that made Times Square so historically appealing, its urban form, was the one thing that was never actually taken into account during the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s. It wasn't until 2009 with Mayor Bloomberg that Times Square actually started improving the urbanism down at street level. The implementation of LED screens indicated the latest stage in Times Square's advertising capabilities, the furthest O.J. Goode's ideas could possibly be pushed. Constant movement, constant light, constant color, constant distraction, and 24/7 around-the-clock advertisement. And now, because our eyes have been trained to quickly adapt to constant movement of bright screens, the average length of a single ad spot in Times Square today is just around 20 seconds long. There are many reasons why New York locals avoid Times Square at all costs. There are an endless amount of urban environments that are just more enjoyable to exist in. It's crowded, it's full of tourist traps and chain restaurants. I mean, personally, I can't even fathom how there's a market for some of this stuff in the city, even for tourists. But I think it's also because it's the architectural manifestation of modern capitalism. In this video, I've told the story of innovation exactly how it happened. But if there is one place in America that represents the downsides of innovation, it's right here in Times Square. But is this really innovation? It certainly fits the typical definition, but think about it. What about this streetscape is actually innovative? Innovation is supposed to improve our lives, improve the human race, but increasingly it rarely ever does. Were the zoning laws written to preserve this identity actually beneficial for the character or the economy of the city as a whole? Does this invite economic growth or scare it away? Is the evolution of the Times Square billboard fundamentally good for humanity in any way? Should that not be the basis on which we judge innovation fundamentally? Maybe it's a gray area in some places, but not here. I think true innovation would have looked like Times Square returning to its earliest roots, a transformation of this wonderful hourglass into a beautiful, grand, European-like public square. No flashy advertisements, just a space that lets people enjoy the history, the theater, the culture. Are there any silver linings? Sure. The overall ground urbanism has improved here with the removal of car traffic along Broadway through Times Square in 2009. That development itself has led to better urbanism along and around Broadway post-pandemic. Hopefully that will one day lead to a car-free Broadway itself. But it is hard not to wonder what Times Square would look like if its buildings were freed from the visual hijacking, if the constant stimulus was released, to see everything sort of slow down here and function more naturally and organically as a square. But what do you think? Is Times Square still the center of the world, or even the center of the city? What do you think would have happened in the early 80s had developers had their way and Times Square lost its massive billboards? I'll see you next week, right here, from 4th Place.